They interpret that, how they put that in the context of the current situation in China. So maybe we can go just naturally by the order, and I would like to give you the floor for a few minutes of a discussion about how you would explain the causes of the current violence that we have been observing in the region during the last months.
Thank you. Salam alaikum, hürmetli gelgiciler. Respect to all of you who've been able to come here and share this very important conference. It's a real honor to be here among scholars and friends in the presence of Rabia Khan and other important figures. As many of you know, I have been banned from China for nearly a decade, so I have not been able to go and see with my own eyes the place that I spent so much time studying, meet the friends that I made when I was there, observe things on the ground. So I'm probably least qualified of the people up here to comment on the causes of most recent violence. If you're aware of my work, you'll know that I've tried to point out that there are several kinds of discontent, and that violent events, public protests and so forth, reflect a certain kind of discontent and a certain kind of personality. People who are braver or perhaps more inclined to violence and so forth. I don't pretend to understand those personalities, but what I want to say, what I've often said, is that their discontent and their public expressions of anger are matched and perhaps in some ways exceeded by quiet discontent among the wider population. Right? And while I think it's important for us to recognize that this violence needs to be accounted for, and if people are engaging in violence in pursuit of global jihad and so forth, this is to be lamented, and I think opposed by people who don't wish to live under Sharia law and so forth, for those of us who do not wish to. But we need not to focus all our attention on that, and to think that that is the only thing that needs to be explained. In my brief remaining time, because I will be brief, I want to draw attention to a personality in this room that I think a lot of us may not have noticed yet, and it's behind me to my left. If you looked at the images of Ilham Tohti in the press in the last few weeks, you undoubtedly saw a picture of him with a camera behind him in his classroom. Okay? And if you looked at some of the footage from his trial, you will know that there were images from his classroom used against him, as well as students who probably under torture were forced to testify against him. Okay? It is an abomination, and I'm afraid it's both a metaphor for and a feature of Chinese rule in Xinjiang, that this brilliant man who worked so hard to speak the truth was surveilled in his own classroom, and images of him speaking were used in the classroom. But when you look at that picture of him with the camera behind him, you realize that camera is not the camera used against him. That camera was used against his students. That camera is watching you. In this room, this camera is a sign of the importance of international exchange, the importance of conferences like this, right? Where people come together from all over the world to speak freely. This enables people across wide distances, people who cannot come to this room, to share their thoughts. This camera is a sign of the good things that a video system hooked up to the internet can do. A camera which merely watches and does not tell you why it's watching until years later it's deployed against you, that's a different kind of camera altogether. And I think it's a metaphor for Chinese policy because the message to Uyghurs from every camera, in every classroom, on every street corner, in every mosque, is we don't trust you. We're watching you and we don't trust you. And I think it's hard to come up with a more eloquent message about the general tenor of Chinese policies. That's long been my concern, and I think it's something we should all be aware of. Thank you.
I want to point out three major points here for the rising violence in the region. Probably the first one would be the failure to recognize that there is a problem, there's an ethnic problem. And ethnic problems necessitate a comprehensive social, economic, cultural, political solution for them. And when you deny the right to express the views of Uyghurs, when you think that it is not an ethnic problem, it is only a security problem, you increasingly securitize the political space and make Uyghurs, more moderate Uyghurs, easy prey for radicalism and probably violence. And one thing that ethnic problems probably everybody here has a good grasp of ethnic conflicts, and one significant dimension of ethnic conflict is ethnic conflicts has two sides. And in order to resolve an ethnic conflict, you need a healthy, meaningful communication between two groups. And if you are considering groups in diaspora, like World Uyghur Congress, as separatists, if you are recognizing more conservative groups as fundamentalists, and if you are recognizing more moderate voices within the country itself as separatists itself and put them in prison, that means you don't have a counterpart to talk about this problem. And without this meaningful conversation, probably you will not be able to solve the problem. And more, in order to be, I don't want to be more pessimist here, but it also shows that there is no intention to resolve this problem itself. The second point is the lack of political space. And in order to solve a problem, you need to provide a political space for nonviolent groups to organize themselves, to create a meaningful leadership, and to bring an organizational discipline so that they can control their members and they can basically represent the people within the country itself. And in the absence of this, of course, you cannot create a solution. And the third, I think the more dangerous part of this emerging violence in the region is it is becoming more increasingly a communal violence, which means that there is, since 9/11, especially since 9/11, there is an increasing degree of anti-Uyghur nationalism emerging in the country. And anti-Uyghur nationalism is not affecting only the state or state institution itself, but also creating anti-Uyghur feelings among the Han Chinese, which is making, since probably the Urumqi events, you see that there's an increasing level of violence, not between the security forces and Uyghur groups, it's also going on, but more importantly between Han Chinese and Uyghurs. I think these three main points is expressing and showing the reason of the rising violence.
Well, since we already have some very good points made, I'm just going to focus on one point that I feel I have particular competency in, since I teach international development, and that's the Chinese government's approach to development in Xinjiang. Often, well, the Chinese government presents development as part of the solution for ethnic tension in the region under a very outdated concept of development, that if you just essentially raise the economic activity in a region, that all boats will rise and that it will benefit everybody. And as I often tell my students, development is not always good. There is good development and there's not so good development, or there's development that's good for some people and not good for other people. And I think that in a lot of ways, the Chinese government could resolve a lot of their problems in Xinjiang by taking a very different approach to development. The approach being taken right now is very top-down. It's focused on building infrastructure and building industries that will only bring in more Han Chinese migrants, which are obviously exacerbating tensions between Han Chinese and Uyghurs. And there's no real engagement with local communities about what kind of development that the local communities want to see. So it's also displacing people from their home regions and their actual houses. It's taking up agricultural land that has been in Uyghur families for generations. And I think that without engaging the Uyghur population about a future vision for Xinjiang, that likely the Chinese government is going to continue to encounter a lot of problems with the Uyghur population in the region.
Yeah, so like Gardner, I think I may be banned from China too, representing the Uyghur Human Rights Project. So I get a lot of my information from secondary sources, and I think that one of the primary issues here is that we don't know enough about these incidents of violence, and a lot of this is due to reporting restrictions or information blackouts, or even huge disincentives for Uyghurs to offer divergent accounts of the state. So, however, the violence it's exhibiting itself in various forms, and the killing of the imam this year in July in Kashgar is certainly one. And land disputes has been proposed as another spark in June last year in 2013. And also, I think that the heavy-handed policing and insensitive policing too has sparked a few incidents, one in particular this year when a 17-year-old Uyghur was shot dead by security police. So China, or the Chinese authorities, characterize all of these incidents, or well, most of them, as terrorist in nature, and having been inspired by overseas. And I think that if we don't take that account at face value, we need to look elsewhere. And this unrest has happened against the backdrop of diminishing or restrictions on Uyghur expression and agency, and also curbs on key markers of their identity or their distinctiveness, such as language and religion. And I feel like grievances, as what I read, are building around state interpretations of so-called illegal religious activities, also policies such as bilingual education and endemic social and economic discrimination. All of these striking at the heart of Uyghur livelihoods and identity. I feel like, as Sean rightfully says, these policies are top-down, and there are very few effective measures to tackle this endemic discrimination that Uyghurs face, capped with a squeeze on peaceful dissent, and tension is going to build. It's very important for Uyghurs in an era of rapid change, where there's an infrastructure overhaul and migration, also urban transformation, that Uyghurs have a voice in this all of this change. The last point I wanted to make about this is about the overseas media. The access has been extraordinarily limited, and I feel like last year we had some AFP reporters who went to Luchun to try to investigate the violence, and they were turned away. And most recently, Washington Post reporters too went to Yarkand County to investigate this recent violence that happened there, also turned away. The two times that I know of where reporters got through the security checkpoints, last year was a BBC reporter went to Singapore, and another New York Times reporter went to Hanirik, and they managed to talk to local Uyghurs at a vastly diverging account from the state narrative emerged, and particularly of concern in Hanirik, where live fire was used against demonstrators. So this is a particular concern.
The question that was put to us was the causes of the recent increased violence, and I'll just touch on that in a minute. But among other things, I'm a historian, and I find it impossible to understand what's happening now without looking at the whole history of the relationship between the Chinese, different Chinese states and the Uyghurs. And I think, I'm not going to give you a long history lecture today, you'll be delighted to hear. But I think we need to recognise that what is happening now is only the latest phase of a long history of violent, sometimes violent conflict, but anyway conflict between the Chinese state and the Uyghurs. It certainly goes back to the 1930s and 1940s, before the Communist Party came to power. You can trace it back to the 1860s, when the Qing dynasty was trying to decide whether to take over Xinjiang. You can go back to the 17th century, and so on and so on. But I think it has to be looked at in that context. By recent, I take it to mean perhaps the phase that we could think of as beginning in 2009 with the Urumqi riots, and the violence particularly in Kashgar and Khotan and southern Xinjiang that's happened since then. A lot of what my colleagues have said, I don't want to repeat because I entirely agree with this, and it's the same kind of thing that I've experienced. Just to give you one image, this afternoon when I talk on Kashgar and Khotan a bit more, I'm going to show some slides of life in those places. Just one image that's stuck in my mind, which I don't have a photograph of, is being in the bazaar in Kashgar, surrounded as usual by lots of relatively poor, not particularly well-dressed Uyghurs, and coming into the bazaar, lording over the whole thing, 3 uniformed officers and people's armed police, very young people, 1 man, 2 women, just showing their authority and how powerful and important they were. And it's this very clear, visible difference between the way the Chinese behave and the way the Uyghurs are, the attitude towards the Uyghurs, and all the points that have been made about the marginalisation of Uyghurs, the discrimination, the relative poverty, all of these things are the background to the recent violence. The actual triggers, in many ways, I think are less important. I mean, we know that in 2009 the trigger was nothing in Xinjiang originally. It was in Dongguan, in Guangdong province, violence there, and the report of the way Uyghurs were treated there that went back to Xinjiang that sparked off the demonstrations and the counter-demonstration of the Han. So the triggers can be almost anything, almost anywhere, and the violence that we've seen may come to an end. It's looking to me as if it isn't, but over the last few days there's been these bomb explosions in Luntai, Uyghur, in Bayangolan prefecture, and I was looking at reports from Radio Free Asia this morning, which almost contradict the reports that came out yesterday and the day before, and we have this great difficulty, as I think Henrik said, in trying to interpret how much violence there being, whether the reports that we're getting are the only violence, whether they're the tip of the iceberg, and exactly how we make them. But don't forget, because the Chinese Communist Party, I'll finish on this point, none of what I say matters. The only thing that matters is the Communist Party's policy is completely correct. They don't need to discuss it with anybody else, whether it's us, Amnesty International, the United States government, the Uyghurs, because they know that their policies on ethnic minorities are correct, and it simply needs 3 external forces, separatism, religious extremism, and terrorism, brought in from outside, that is causing the problems. And it is really, really difficult to get through to anybody in China if you come up with
No, that's perfect. I think the different elements each of you brought really give us a kind of global picture of everything we will be discussing during these 2 days and a half, and each of our panels will be probably going further and deeper in almost all the elements you mentioned here. So I have several questions to follow up. One of them, and maybe not all of you would be interested in answering it, but I would be really that would be really, I think, a good point for the audience to come back on the fact that now violence is spreading outside the Xinjiang region itself, and the fact that because of migration of Uyghurs also having to go in other cities, in other regions of China, we see this, as Kilic was mentioning, this violence becoming an interethnic one between Han Chinese and Uyghurs, and I was wondering what does that mean for globally the Chinese nationality policy and the risk of kind of uncontrolled or controlled or kind of Pandora box, opening the Pandora box of kind of interethnic violence spreading outside the historical Uyghur region. So if some of you would like to follow on that.
I can say a few words actually. Usually the nationalism, state-sponsored nationalism, has a very dangerous boomerang effect, and at a certain point you can mobilize your people within your territory by creating glorious past, by kind of creating the messages of unity, solidarity, and loyalty to the state. But after certain points, we see in Chinese nationalism, especially in 1990s Chinese nationalism, we see in different instances that at certain point people start to become more nationalist than state itself. And people may find the actions of the states unsatisfactory or insufficient to satisfy their feelings. We see this in several instances. One of them was EP3 plane crash, actually. when the state-sponsored terrorism, in the first days of the demonstrations, we see that the local authorities were carrying the demonstrators with buses in front of the US Embassy. But when the Chinese nationalists feel that they were humiliated not only by the United States but by the failure of the Chinese state itself, at that point they started to throw rocks not only to the US Embassy but the Chinese building, the Chinese state building as well. So after certain points, my main concern about this intercommunal violence is it becomes at a certain point that it is uncontrollable. And state basically loses its monopoly to rally the people around the flag. And after that point, it becomes very difficult to stop the kind of, like the humanitarian disasters, basically, not only the communal violence.
Well, I'll just mention that reports I heard from students of mine from China over the last year, over the summer when they went back to China, they said that the police presence in large cities, including Beijing, has just become incredibly widespread. To the extent that there's security forces with machine guns all over the city, which is obviously going to affect not only Uyghurs but affect the whole population. So I think that that's one of the things that we're seeing in terms of the violence spreading outside of Xinjiang. And I also think that it's just it's very much an overreaction, I would say, to have this extent of militarization of urban space throughout China, given several of these violent instances. So I do think that it's likely to escalate the problem.
Yes, I think there's been a profound change in Chinese politics over the last 6 months. And I think this may have a great impact on what's happening in Xinjiang as well as elsewhere in China. And although when we're talking about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, we really like to look at it from a Central Asian perspective, we really do have to take into account the situation, the political situation in China. The violence has spread to outside Xinjiang. The bizarre, in many ways, crash of the jeep into the crowd in front of Tiananmen Square. This is nothing new. In the 1990s, there were bus bombs in Beijing. The amount of spread, the degree to which violence has spread to Beijing is not that great. It's quite clearly something that deeply worries the Chinese Communist Party. Over the summer, there's been a change in the balance of power within the Politburo, Politburo Standing Committee. Whereas when the new leadership emerged in 2012, 2013, it looked quite collective. Now Xi Jinping has really increased his own personal power to a large extent. And one of the ways he's done that, and this is only beginning to come out, and the evidence is only beginning to come out, is by building on what seemed rather tenuous links with the People's Liberation Army at first. So I think we're going to see more action, more intervention, political intervention by the People's Liberation Army. And of course, when it comes to Xinjiang, they are the final recourse that the state has to deal with any unrest at all. And it reminds me of 1983, when People's Armed Police were founded to deal with increasing unrest as the reform program developed and as certain constraints were loosened within China more generally.
Thank you. I think that was really a great insight. Another question I have is this time more related to the kind of foreign policy context in which all this situation is developing. And I was wondering if you could comment about the regional context and how China is playing on the war on terror narrative, the fact that China is becoming a key partner for the Central Asian state, for example, also around Afghanistan, and the fact that everything going on now in Syria and Iraq is very much a kind of good argument for China in trying to look like it's online with the international community in fighting radicalism, and of course the connection made by the Chinese authorities between clearly cultural and social revendication claims and the Islamization or radicalization, so-called, of the Uyghur movement. So if you could comment on how this foreign policy context is also in interaction with the way China is managing the current situation.
It's a really great question. And having spent considerable time in Central Asia in the last few years, I'd like to talk about that a little bit and revert back to the violence in Kunming. I think we have a better sense of episodes of violence in Xinjiang, and some of them were probably precipitated by local policies, suppression of religious activity, and so forth. The episode in Kunming seemed initially really strange and hard to comprehend. I think to the extent that we have reliable information about what happened there, it seems that this is a group of people who were trying to emigrate from China via Yunnan into Southeast Asia, where they figured they would be able to get safe passage to somewhere else in the world. What on earth were these people doing so far from Xinjiang trying to immigrate? Well, part of the answer is that Beijing has so successfully taken the governments of Central Asia in hand through the Shanghai Organization, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so forth, gotten all of them to treat Uyghur communities in Central Asia as possibly unreliable, to crack down on Uyghur organizations, and so forth. I have colleagues and friends here from Central Asia who can probably comment more knowledgeably on this. But I think to a large extent, the zone of Central Asia was once viewed with by Uyghurs in Xinjiang as an area where they had many Uyghur brothers and many other Central Asian Turkic brothers and sisters, has been turned into a really unfriendly zone, and that border has been, to the extent that one can, with such a long zone, has been closed down to people trying to move across to flee from the policies they don't like, and so forth. So that I think, in fact, Beijing's extraordinary economic power and the dependence of those post-independent Central Asian states on some largesse from somewhere other than Russia has been quite adverse to the interests of Uyghurs in Central Asia and in Xinjiang, and I think this will continue to be a problem.
I think one dimension of this is the changing nature of the Uyghur problem. When we are talking about Uyghur issue, we usually consider it as the same issue, especially for China, that didn't change for years now. But I think since the end of the Cold War, this problem itself started to change, and for China itself now, the problem become somehow kind of region-mastic, right? Both domestic problem, but it has serious implications for the Chinese policies towards the region itself. So I'm not a historian here, but I know that historically China considered this region as a protective buffer between different tribes and the main China. But now it is becoming, it's changing its nature. The region itself is, for China, becoming a springboard of kind of projecting zone of influence to Central Asia. And the ideas about the march towards the West and everything shows this. So we see now an increasing degree of Asianization of the problem itself. And when Central Asia is protecting its influence to the Central Asian nations, it's not only economic influence, it is not only the demographic influence. We see that increasing political influence as well. We see that in Central Asia, in some countries, there is almost a Chinese model emerging, an authoritarian form of capitalism, which kind of, like keep the tyranny itself, but create a liberal economy within the countries. I think this is a major problem, and in the long run, it may create a Xinjiangization of Central Asia itself, actually. The second dimension, second international dimension that we need to talk about is Chinese perception of the region is changing with each and every international threat China is facing. When we see in 1990s the operation towards the operation in Kosovo and others, we see that there is an increasing degree of Balkanization discussion in Chinese media. And when the Balkanization discussion started, the first target for China to protect its security and safety was East Turkestan itself. And the strike hard campaigns actually started with this international context itself. And after 9/11, we see another strike hard campaign mostly because there was a huge suspicion that American presence in Afghanistan will create a major threat for safety, security, and territorial integrity of China itself. And we see the same level of increasing violence, increasing repression with the Asia pivot policy. In Washington, D.C., we don't know what Asia pivot, if it still exists, what does it entail, like we discussed, is there still an Asia pivot policy? But from the perception of China, it's a major threat. And the threat is coming from the East, and China is kind of very uncomfortable because of the over-reliance on the sea lanes for transport of natural resources and trade itself. And because of that, the only exit for China from the land lanes is Xinjiang itself, and the Trans-Eurasian railways, pipelines, even the Gwadar port and its connections to China is passing from the Xinjiang itself. So China is seeing this problem now not only a threat for its national unity or territorial integrity, but also for its long-term strategy of kind of regional dominance and global challenge.
I'll pick up the other theme you mentioned in terms of the global war on terror. Earlier this summer, a Chinese publication asked me to write an op-ed about this issue because they were, the people who asked me were concerned that China was going down the road that the United States had gone down, and they asked if there was some sort of parallels that could be drawn, the negative aspects of embarking on this widespread war against not necessarily a people but a concept, and very much targeted towards the Islamic world. And unfortunately, that they were not able to get that op-ed published, which kind of demonstrates, again, something that was said earlier about the Chinese state's lack of desire to listen to any other voices about this. But I think it's a really important point that we look at the results of the American war on terror, and frankly, I think even the hawks in Washington are starting to question whether this was a good idea from the start, because we're seeing with the escalation of things in Syria that we probably just exacerbated the situation. And I do think, right now that the Chinese government's considering this as an opportunity to link Uyghurs again to this global movement, but it's a very dangerous game to play, particularly if we do begin to see some of the things that Kilich was talking about in terms of China becoming more and more involved in Central Asia and Pakistan. If they become perceived as the aggressor against Islam, I think that's likely to just create more and more problems for China.
I guess this is the curse of being fourth in line. So I'll just make one quick point on the question, which is that China claims that a lot of the violence that happens in the region is overseas inspired, and that Uyghurs have links to international jihadi networks. On the very few occasions when the international community asks for more information about violent incidents, it quickly becomes an internal matter and not up for discussion. So there's an inherent contradiction here. If the problem is international, it seems that the solutions are being all carried out domestically, and the Uyghurs are facing the brunt of all of that. So in terms of sharing that information with the international community, allowing access to foreign media to go and investigate these so-called overseas inspired incidents, and also, I think most importantly too, is the end to the communication blackouts that happen as soon as an incident happens, and I feel like a lot of on-the-ground information gets lost.
I'd like to continue this discussion on external impact on internal violence and refer back to Gardner's point about the Kunming attack, which I found utterly bizarre. It seems completely out of line with all the other violent incidents that we've had. And the only thing it reminds me of is a video which Henrik and I discussed over the internet. It seems so theatrical. The way, I mean, it was a horrific incident, the knife attack on Kunming Station, but it was theatrical, the way that people were dressed. They weren't dressed as Uyghurs were dressed, they were dressed as some sort of cartoon character, jihadists. And so I found myself thinking, is this some sort of strange, well, I don't even want to say what I thought, but it didn't seem to me to be a genuine violent attack compared with all the others that we've had. But the point that Gardner made is an important one, that this was a group of people who were moving outside China, who were immigrated. We've since seen videos of Uyghurs in Laos, Cambodia, I think, I'm not sure. Since then, there have been problems with groups of Uyghurs in Indonesia. So they are moving out as refugees, and clearly they're moving in. Some of them are moving into countries which are either Muslim countries like Indonesia, although how on earth they communicate, there's a huge problem. And it sounds as if some of them have had links with Jamiat Islamah in Indonesia, one of the main Muslim organisations there. But it is a real problem, and it's what Henrik said. We are told by the Chinese that all the trouble is these foreigners. And ever since the Mazar-e-Sharif episode, where there were a number of Uyghurs arrested in the closing stages of the war, of that particular phase of the war in Afghanistan, it's been impossible to get any objective and reliable evidence about the links between violence in Xinjiang and outside. Very briefly, I'm trying to work out, I've only just started doing this, a typology of the sort of violence that there is. Very local stuff, some violence in the mountain, some which seem to have external connections. Some of the violence I understand because it's reactive, it's demonstrations, it's going and getting your family out of custody. It seems to be perfectly normal whether or not you approve of the violent way it's doing. I get my family out of custody if they were being held by the People's Armed Police. Revenge and release, that categorises what I've said there. Attacks on collaborators, this recent murder of the imam of the mosque. But again, it's not new. There was an attack in 1993 on another imam at that mosque. He survived. And finally, whether or not this is the case, are there guerrilla attacks by partisan bands in the mountains? Which is, again, nothing new. Go back to 1954, 4 years before Osama bin Laden was born, and you find that sort of thing and that sort of thing. So I think until there's more evidence we can trust, we are looking at an internal issue which has got some external ramifications.
Thank you so much. I think that was a wonderful overview of the main point that we need to have in mind if we want to understand how to articulate all the different levels and understand the current situation in the region. So first I would like to thank our discussants. You will be able to listen to each of them longer during their presentation at their own panel. Now I would like to stop for a very short coffee break, and then that will be organized outside, and then invite you to come back for a second short roundtable where we will be looking at Uyghur in geopolitics over time, because we also consider that having a long-term historical perspective is very important, and that's also a way that we will use here in George Washington University to celebrate the importance of the Russian and Soviet knowledge on the Uyghurs, and we have a lot of scholars from Russia and Central Asia who join us, and that's really also integrating this historical perspective with the current issues is also a way of reconnecting Western scholarships with the Soviet and Russian Central Asian scholarships. So please stay with us and please join me in thanking our first discussant.